Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar event. My name is Simon and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. Firstly, just a big thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your no doubt busy schedules today to engage with us and listen to us in regards to the Windsor Framework arrangement for parcels. As I said, this webinar follows on from some recent communications that you'll have received that HMRC issued regarding the new arrangements for parcels moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which you will need to be prepared for by the 31st of March 2025. The aim of this webinar today is to bring some more colour to that comms product that you'll have seen around those new arrangements, and we're going to spend some time today explaining what those new arrangements are, talking a little bit through the specifics in relation to business parcels, or B2B, as you'll see on the slides as we go through them. We'll also take some time to talk to you about the UK Internal Market Scheme and why that is relevant for business parcels and how you can apply for this. We'll then go through some illustrative journeys that will show the end-to-end process for moving consumer and business parcels from Great Britain to Northern Ireland under these new arrangements. And we'll wrap up with a Q&A session at the end of the webinar today. First, again, a big thank you for the Q&A session. We have had a number of pre-submitted questions when you registered for this event, and we will be looking to answer as many of them as possible. A pre-warning that we won't be answering all of those questions today. Some of those questions were company specific, so we'll look to, if you asked anything like that, we'll look to engage with you individually following this webinar to provide that one-to-one assistance. And some other questions I think we do address during this presentation today. However, during the webinar, if you do have any other questions or anything else that pops up, you can use the Q&A function to ask those, and subject to time, we will try to answer those at the end of the session also. However, if we don't get to any of those questions or your specific questions, we'll commit to taking any unanswered questions away, either picking up directly with you on those questions or using that to tailor any future comms or guidance that we will be publishing. And one final note, we will also be running a couple of polls today. So just a thank you in advance for contributing to those. Now, before I get into the content, I would like to introduce myself and my colleagues who will be speaking to you a little bit more today. So my name's Simon Pettigrew. I head up the Northern Ireland Customs Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I have specific responsibility in terms of readiness for the business-to-business parcel arrangements. With me today, I have my colleague Catherine Ruffles, who leads on stakeholder engagement also in relation to business parcels. We have my colleague Ewan Nelson, who heads up the Northern Ireland Post and Parcels team, and Mark Brown, who heads up the team responsible for the customs policy aspects of the Windsor Framework. A thank you to them for joining us today, and I'll let them introduce themselves a bit more when they come in to speak. So before we get into some of the specifics of the new arrangements, I thought I would take a step back and just go back to a little bit of what the Windsor Framework is. Now, you'll be aware that following Brexit, the UK government and the European Union agreed to the Northern Ireland Protocol that came into effect from January 2021. And on the 27th of February 2023, the UK and the EU agreed the Windsor Framework, and that was aiming to address the genuine concerns around the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol by providing a new arrangements to enhance the smooth flow of trade within the UK internal market. Under the Windsor Framework, the UK and the EU agreed new arrangements for moving parcels between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and these arrangements protect consumer parcels from the requirements for customs declarations and any other international customs paperwork that would have been required under the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, there has been extensive work preparing for these arrangements to take effect. However, several events over the last year or so, including the general election and the period leading up to the general election, have impacted the readiness of traders and sort of wider border industry. As such, we communicated that businesses should now be fully prepared for these arrangements to come into effect by the 31st of March 2025. And as we go through the slides, you will see a number of acronyms that we have used. So I thought it'd be useful to set out some of these acronyms up front so you know what we're talking about. The first one that you're likely to see is UKIMS, which is regarding the UK Internal Market Scheme. Now, the UK Internal Market Scheme is an authorisation that allows eligible goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to be moved not at risk if they're for sale to or final use by an end consumer located in the United Kingdom. And that means those goods will not be charged duty on entry into Northern Ireland from free circulation if they're moving in from free circulation in GB. Worth noting that UKIMS is only in relation to business parcels and is not applicable to any parcels moving for consumers in Northern Ireland. The second we have here is the Internal Market Movement Information, or IMI. So the IMI is the simplified dataset that requires less data to be submitted for business-to-business movements into CDS, or the Customs Declaration System. And to use the simplified dataset, goods must be eligible to move under UKIMS, and a business must hold that authorisation. We then have the simplified processes for internal market movements, and that sets out the new facilitations for goods movements under the Windsor Framework for goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And the final acronym is the UK Carrier Scheme, or UKC. And the UKC is an authorisation that allows businesses to move eligible consumer parcels from Great Britain to Northern Ireland in line with the new arrangements under the Windsor Framework. Now, just finally, before we get into the details of the new arrangements, as touched on earlier, we will be running a short poll here, and that's to help us gauge industry readiness for the new arrangements, and also to help understand how useful this webinar has been and how we can tailor our response going forward. I think if we can move on just to the next slide. So you can see the question that we're asking here is how ready you feel for the new arrangements under the Windsor Framework. And I'd appreciate if you could take some time to complete the poll that's out now in the Q&A, and we'll look at the results of this and the final question that we'll ask shortly at the end of the webinar. While you're taking some time to complete this, I would like to introduce Catherine Ruffles, who will start to talk to you about the new arrangements for parcels under the Windsor Framework.
Thank you, Simon. So as Simon briefly introduced, I'm Catherine Ruffles. I've recently joined the Northern Ireland Customs team in HMRC. Prior to that, I've worked in trade, customs and border focused roles in government for the past 4 years. I will now talk everyone through what the new parcel arrangements are. So the new parcel arrangements will differ depending on the sender and the recipient, and there'll be different processes for businesses in terms of whether it's business or consumer routes that the parcels are following. So for consumer parcels, there will be a new consumer route. This route will not require individual customs declarations, and there will also be no safety and security requirements, and no duty will be required. UK businesses, they also won't need to sign up for the UKIMS to use the consumer route, and should provide standard commercial information to their carrier, which will include, for instance, a plain English goods description. Now, there will be weight limits in effect for the consumer route, so that will be up to 100 kilograms per package for a single item, or 31.5 kilograms per package if the consignment is made up of multiple items. Now, for business-to-business parcels, movements will be eligible to use the simplified processes for internal market movements, where the sending or receiving business for the movement holds a UK internal market scheme authorisation, and if the goods also meet the criteria to move not at risk under UKIMS. So this means that eligible goods will be able to move under the UK internal market scheme with a reduced data set and also with no duty. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of how to identify whether it's a business or consumer, you will need to understand, whether your customers are businesses or consumers, as this will impact the information that your parcel carrier requires. So you might know this information already. For example, your customer holds a business account with you, or your customer requires a VAT invoice, or maybe because the characteristics of your customers' transactions indicate that they're a business. But you will have to inform your carrier whether the parcels you're moving are going to a consumer or a business, and also discuss with them how they wish to be informed about that. And the arrangements might also vary depending on the carrier, your business model, and other commercial arrangements. So it is important that you discuss with your carrier how they would like to be informed about that. And in terms of the business-to-business requirements, so on business-to-business requirements specifically, if you use a parcel carrier, you may not need to use the trader support service. So some parcel carriers will make arrangements for completing the business-to-business declarations as part of their door-to-door service. But it is important that you speak to your parcel carrier, as mentioned, if you move B2B parcels. If you're a trader making business-to-business parcel movements from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, it's important that either the sending or receiving business, so it can be either, is authorised under UKIMS in order to be able to benefit from the simplified processes for internal market movements. So business-to-business parcels that do not move under UKIMS, they will, however, need to follow the same processes as freight movements when the Windsor Framework parcels arrangements come into effect. So this means you need to follow full customs processes, and you might have to pay the applicable rate of EU duty after any claims of preference and reliefs are made. So as your parcel carrier will submit data to the customs declaration service, you will have to provide some additional information to your parcel carrier, but UKIMS will allow goods to move without the need for those full customs declarations and without incurring the duty. So to be eligible, goods must move from a business in Great Britain to a business in Northern Ireland, and they must be for sale to or for final use by end consumers located in the United Kingdom. So in certain cases where neither the sending or receiving business holds a UKIMS authorisation, or the goods are at risk of entering the EU, you won't be able to benefit from the simplified process of internal market movements, and you might need to pay a duty. The duty can be reclaimed, it's important to mention, if the item does not move into the EU, but you should check again with your parcel carrier to understand their processes for this. And just for clarity, parcels for consumers in Northern Ireland do not require any customs declarations, and they will not incur any duty. Thank you. I'll now pass over to my colleague, Mark.
Hello, and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mark from the Northern Ireland Customs Policy team in HMRC as well, and my team is responsible for the UK Internal Market Scheme authorisation that we've been mentioning. So what is the UK Internal Market Scheme? It is an HMRC authorisation which allows you to move eligible goods as not at risk of entering the EU. As Catherine's been saying, this means that they will not be charged duty if they are entering NI, Northern Ireland, from free circulation in Great Britain. And UKIMS will also be the authorisation that grants access to the simplified processes, which we're introducing under the Windsor Framework. It's an authorisation that we introduced last year in 2023, and at the time of writing, over 9,000 businesses have already been authorised. From a B2B perspective, so in advance of the new arrangements being introduced next year, businesses, whether they're sending or receiving B2B parcels, can apply to be authorised under UKIMS. If you don't have a UKIMS authorization currently, our advice is strongly that you shouldn't hesitate in submitting an application to ensure that you are ready well in advance of the 31st of March 2025. That will, as we were saying, mean that you're in a position where eligible goods, which are moving in business-to-business parcels from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, will be able to move without the need for a full international customs declaration and without incurring duty. The requirement for sending B2B parcels under a UKIMS authorization is that the goods must be, firstly, for sale or final use by end consumers located in the United Kingdom, not be subject to an EU trade remedy, or otherwise a Category 1 good under the Windsor Framework, and we're providing further guidance on what the categories are under the Windsor Framework as we speak. They shouldn't be subject to processing in Northern Ireland unless one of the sort of criteria are met. We do set those out in our guidance what those are, but the main ones are that your annual turnover is being less than £2 million, or the goods being used for one of certain approved purposes, those being food for sale to end consumers, construction, direct provision of health or care services, non-profit activities, or animal feed on premises located in Northern Ireland. So to be authorised for UKIMS, we will look at your business's compliance history, i.e. have you followed taxation and customs rules over the last 3 years. We'll look at financial standing, record keeping, systems, controls and evidence, and also your establishment. So you must be established in the United Kingdom. That can either be in Great Britain or Northern Ireland. If you're not established, or if you don't have a fixed place of business in Northern Ireland, you're required to have an indirect customs representative in Northern Ireland, and I'll say a little bit more about what that means in just a moment. So here we go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So a little slide here just on how to apply. So the basic steps for applying for a UKIMS authorization are to review our guidance page. That's up on gov.uk, and we'll provide the link to that at the end of this presentation. Then you log onto your government gateway account as you would when you're doing, accessing all sorts of government services, and that's where you'll manage the application. And that's where you kind of provide the relevant evidence and submit your application. There is a number there if you need support through that, but also we do have quite extensive guidance that we're going to provide the link to later on. And if we go to the next slide, so as I say, the authorization has been put in place for well over a year now, and have been operating well, we think. But we do have a good idea of where people sometimes find it more difficult or are sort of unsure what we're asking for. So the next few slides are some sort of top tips for applying for UKIMS. So the first one is about EORI. So a prerequisite for moving goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is having an economic operator's registration and identification number, known in the parlance as an EORI. If you are established in Northern Ireland or have a fixed place of business there, you must apply for the scheme using an XI EORI. If you're established in parts of the UK other than Northern Ireland, i.e. only established in GB but with no fixed place of business in NI, you can apply for the scheme with either an XI EORI or a GB EORI. If you hold an XI EORI, you should use it to apply to the scheme. So yeah, there are a few different options there, but yeah, and it will depend on kind of where you're established. Indirect representative. So what do we mean by that? This is sort of a basic rule for making a declaration under UKIMS, which is that if you are established in parts of the UK other than Northern Ireland, i.e. only established in GB, you'll need to use an indirect representative when you move goods in NI using the new arrangements for B2B parcels. For B2B parcel movements, your fast parcel operator or carrier will usually act as your indirect representative, but you should confirm that with them, that is the role they're be taking up. Check that with your carrier, and then what you would do is provide the details in the Northern Ireland address when prompted to provide details of an indirect representative. We recognise that in the cases of moving parcels, you might not always be using the same indirect rep for every single movement you make. That's clearly acceptable and understandable, provided the indirect representative you're using for each movement meets the criteria, i.e. they have a base in Northern Ireland, so that the declaration is still being being represented by someone based in Northern Ireland. On the other hand, if you are established in Northern Ireland or you already have a fixed place of business there, you're not required by the form to provide any information about the indirect representative, because you've got a little bit more room for manoeuvre. And then on the next slide, please, if that's all right. So this is about financial standing. So there are 3 tests we apply to meet the good financial standing requirements. Firstly, you must have sufficient financial standing to meet your obligations and fulfill your commitments under the scheme. You must not be subject to bankruptcy proceedings. And thirdly, during the 3 years before your application, you must have fulfilled your financial obligations. What we mean by that is payments of things like payments of customs duties and other duties, taxes or charges which are collected on or in connection with the import or export of goods. If your business began trading more recently than 3 years ago, we may ask for additional evidence, such as a profit and loss forecast, maybe a balance sheet or budget, whatever is enough to kind of give us a little bit of assurance around that. We do recognise that there are different kinds of business, different sizes of business, and we aim to be pragmatic in considering your eligibility under this section. For example, there is no specific expectation under this scheme that a new business would be making a profit immediately. At the moment they're kind of set up, each application is considered on a case-by-case basis, and the Windsor Framework enables us to apply that sort of pragmatism on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, and then the next slide, this is around sort of people involved in the movement. So first of all, that you'll be asked about the people in charge of the business, under which you need to provide the details of the people in charge, all the people in charge of the business, so directors and board members. That may differ if you are a smaller small business. If you're a sole trader, then it's going to be you. So that needs to be kind of proportionate to what your business is. If you are registered with Companies House, you should ensure you add the details of the directors and board members that are listed there on Companies House, under the Officers tab. If you are a different type of organisation that isn't registered on Companies House, it will be different. For example, the example we've kind of got is a charity could be the trustees and senior management. A partnership would need to provide details of all the partners, and a sole trader would just provide their own personal details. Secondly, on this slide, you've got we ask about the people who are in charge of goods movements under the scheme. They may, if you're a small business, be the same as the directors already provided, and you just need to indicate that on the form. But if you are a larger business, where the responsibility, the person who's effectively knows what's being moved under the scheme, and is able to locate those records, you might have delegated that responsibility to employees, and in which case we're asking for sort of senior employees like head of tax and compliance, head of customs, head of logistics and operations. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about there. Next slide, please. And then, so the test for UKIMS is about whether the goods are for final use by or end consumers located in the UK. Clearly, where the receiving business is the authorised party, this assurance might be more readily available. So, for example, you'll know that the goods are going to be sold in a shop, and that shop is based in Northern Ireland, and that's relatively straightforward. For B2B parcel movements into Northern Ireland, the sending businesses, it may be a little bit more, maybe a little bit more involved. So what we'd ask businesses to do is kind of obtain confirmation that the goods are for sale to or final use by end consumers located in the UK. And you can do that, for example, by updating terms or conditions or contracts with the customers you're sending to in order to reflect that requirement. It could also be the case if the Northern Ireland business is selling goods onto other businesses in Northern Ireland. If you're a wholesaler and you're kind of passing them on, you can kind of get the kind of commercial, the agreed confirmation that way. When you're applying for UKIMS, you could explain, or probably should explain, what are those arrangements. You could explain the contractual arrangements or what updates to your terms and conditions you're making. And there are obviously digital solutions to that, like putting the tick box on a website. And what you will do to put those in place, even better, upload a copy or a screenshot of what you've put in place as supporting evidence, so we can see how you're kind of checking that. Yeah, and then I think this is the last one. So there are a few things here, all of which kind of relate to, follow on from that, the requirement I've been describing there. So these are all things that, are facilitations, the things that facilitate you being able to show that you have that kind of control over what's being moved, and that's what we're looking for. Again, the kind of complexity of the evidence required needs to be and will be kind of commensurate to the size and complexity of the business. But in all cases, we need you to show that you've considered the requirements and have described in the form how you'll fulfill them in sufficient detail. So one of them is around software packages. So we ask you to name the specific software package you will use to keep records of the goods movements into Northern Ireland. We ask you to explain specifically how the software package, how the software you're using, will work to keep records, giving it evidence that the goods are not at risk and are for sale to end consumers located in the UK or Northern Ireland. If the software package used isn't integrated into your accounting system, which may well be the case, we ask you to explain how you'll do that sort of cross-checking and reconcile, how you'll handle that. Under data security and protection, if you have one, if you have them, you can upload a copy of your policies and procedures to show how you meet the requirements for data protection. Alternatively, you can kind of explain in the free text box that you'll see there when you go on to log on. If you are a small business using a physical filing system, that's fine. You can explain what precautions you have in place, whether that's fireproof lockboxes, backups of records, just so we know how those kind of, how you're going to preserve those records if we need them, and how you're going to keep them safe. And then there's also a section finally about prevention of illegal activities. You could upload a copy of relevant policies and procedures. Do you have a fraud prevention or probity policy to evidence the controls in place? Or if not, again, explain in the free text box. If you are a smaller business using a physical filing system, again, you can explain what precautions you have in place to sort of make sure that movements are being properly reconciled. How do you audit the accounts, and how do you, what instructions do you have in place for staff to report any compliance issues up through into HMRC. So yeah, there's obviously a few sections there, and hopefully that's helpful. And as I say, we encourage you to make that application in as soon as you're able to. That brings to an end my section on the UKIMS application process. So I'm now going to hand over to Ewan, who is going to talk through some parcels journeys.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for making the time today. And as introduced earlier, my name's Ewan Nelson, and I work in HMRC's Post and Parcels Declarations team, particularly focusing obviously here on Northern Ireland. So I'm going to take you through 3 illustrative parcel journeys. I think there is kind of a bit of a caveat on this, but kind of your mileage may vary. It will depend, for example, if you're using different parcel carriers, they might have slightly different commercial arrangements. That this should set out a typical kind of journey. that's relevant in the vast majority of cases. So the first one we'll go through is on the kind of consumer route that Catherine mentioned before, and then we'll do 2 business-to-business journeys, one with UKIMS and then one without UKIMS, to show you the difference and the benefits of using UKIMS. So if we could move to the consumer journey, please. So this is taking a business to consumer GB to NI journey. So this is just someone, a normal private individual buying something in Northern Ireland and having it shipped in from Great Britain. In terms of a return, so a C to B, which I know was mentioned before, you could just flip this journey in terms of the actors, but this is all GB to NI, nothing to do with kind of any Northern Ireland to GB movements, and is kind of required to be moved by somebody who signed up to the UK carrier scheme. As was mentioned before as well, though kind of the shorthand there is if you're using a parcel operator, the vast majority will be signed up, and we've been intensively engaging with them to move stuff through this process. So as also noted before, one of the kind of chief benefits of using this consumer journey is that there are no individual customs declarations, so no interaction with the Customs Declaration Service or CDS. There is no need for you to be signed up to UKIMS for these business to consumer journeys. There are no safety and security declarations. There is also no duty on these goods regardless of value if they're a business to consumer journey and fit within the weight limits that were mentioned before. And just to quickly note, and I've seen a question on this already, if something falls outside of the weight limits, they would then have to move along the business to business route. So this is for the business to consumer stuff that's within that limit. So if we start at the beginning of the journey here, obviously someone in Northern Ireland, probably online, buys something from a business in Great Britain. Once that's purchased, the sending GB business will need to provide standard commercial information to their parcel operator or kind of anyone else who signed up for the UK carrier scheme, much like you do today. So you'll go on, either you might have kind of an API integration if you're moving a lot of stuff, but if you just go onto a website to purchase this, as always, whenever you send something you have to fill in a form, you'll fill in there. When we say standard commercial information, it is, the main things are the sender and recipient's address, a description of the items in the parcel, and the value and the weight of the parcel. So it should hopefully be quite familiar, similar stuff. There will also need to be a bit in this process in order to give that operator moving your parcel and understanding that this is indeed a business to consumer parcel. But here we haven't gone into much depth, as again that depends on the commercial arrangements of the operator. Maybe that's just part of their T&C. So if you move something down a certain product, for example, that it is a business to consumer, there may be something else you need to tick or confirm to say that it is indeed a business to consumer movement. But I think I want to highlight here that HMRC will take a pragmatic and proportionate approach on this stuff. We are not expecting perfection. We are expecting people to have reasonable processes in place in order to understand whether it's a business or a consumer. So at that point, parcel is handed over to the operator, delivered to Northern Ireland consumer. And if you're that sending GB business, that should be pretty much close to the end of the story for you. It should just move again like any other parcel would move throughout the UK. But just to take the journey through for you to see it end to end, that operator will submit their UKC authorization reference, essentially proving they signed up to this UK carrier scheme. That will allow all the consumer parcels they have to move without any of those individual customs declarations, without the safety and security declaration. It's the thing that triggers the point that there's no duty required there. They will provide the data to HMRC separate to a traditional customs declaration, but that will be done kind of in large bulk chunks, again, because there's no individual declaration here. And then finally, the parcel will arrive with a Northern Ireland consumer safe and sound. So to kind of summarise the consumer journey here, it really is quite simple. You need to kind of have some sort of process to understand whether it's a consumer or not, provide standard commercial information to your operator, and they move it. So could we move on to the business to business with UKIMS? you can see in the top left, there's a little bit about the UKIMS application process. Obviously, kind of Mark's just taken us very well through all the process there, so I won't dwell on that too much. Essentially, what we're trying to point out in the top is that it can be either the sending or the receiving business signing up to UKIMS here. HMRC will grant the authorization, and then the responsible business agrees with the FPO, the commercial arrangements, standard operating procedures for handling business-to-business parcels, and which party will act as the UKIMS authorised importer of record. So to put that into a bit more plain English, you need to be able to tell your operator who's the one who's got UKIMS, who's going to be that responsible party there. And again, your mileage may vary on that process from your operator, so do please go talk to your parcel operator and they can help you go through that process. Going through the journey itself, again, someone in Northern Ireland will buy something from business in Great Britain. This time it is a Northern Irish business rather than a private individual. That sending GB business provides the relevant data to that fast parcel operator or other operator, and then the sending business provides details on which UKIMS authorization to use. Again, this can be the GB businesses or the recipients, and the ORI number. Parcel is again handed over to the operator to deliver. The operator will submit the internal market movement information on to the Customs Declaration Service. They will also complete a safety and security declaration. But it's probably worth pointing to at this stage, as the goods start to move through the border, what we've got in the top right, which is noting if you use a parcel carrier, they may complete that IMI on your behalf as part of their service handling or that kind of customs process, and in that case you'll only need to provide the parcel carrier with a plain English goods description and standard commercial information roughly along the lines of what I talked about in the consumer world. You will not be able to use the traded goods profile for goods moved by most of those parcel carriers, however. So that information's been provided, they've gone through the process, good moves through the border, and critically here no duty is due because it is the UKIMS movement as mentioned before. So to summarise again, there is a process here of signing up to UKIMS, getting authorised and getting a procedure in place with your operator to make sure they understand whose UKIMS number is being used and can be sent to our recipients. Otherwise, again, quite kind of simple journey of provide the information to the operator. They will handle the process, potentially with the traded goods profile, potentially it's a parcel operator who is doing that IMI on your behalf, depending, and then the good moves with no duty. So we can move to the final journey, please. So this is a business to business with no UKIMS. For example, when you know that parcel is moving on to the EU. In order for the correct process to be followed and to make sure that the operator understands that it needs to move as a non-UKIMS journey, the GB business will need to inform that operator that the goods aren't eligible to move into UKIMS. No one can act as the authorised importer of record for this movement, so effectively the flip of what we've just talked about. Otherwise, this journey does look very familiar, so kind of forgive the persistence here, but the items getting purchased by a Northern Ireland business from a GB business, that GB business provides the relevant data to the FPO, as I've just gone through, that you would inform the operator that it's not eligible to move under UKIMS. Parcel is handed over. A customs declaration is made in CDS, as well as a safety and security declaration. I think it's important to highlight a key difference here, is that the operator is submitting a customs declaration on CDS rather than the internal market movement information, and this declaration does include a 10-digit commodity code and further information compared to the UKIMS journey. So I think it's kind of one of the key benefits here. If you're using UKIMS, it means if you move down this non-UKIMS journey, you are going to have to provide that additional information. There may also be risk or intelligence-led checks on goods. So when we say risk and intelligence-led, what we mean here is we will be doing these checks when we believe there's a reason to do so, not because there's kind of some arbitrary target to set, because we are committed as a government to the smooth flow of parcels. as with all the other journeys, operator will deliver the parcel to Northern Ireland business. But here, because it is a non-UKIMS journey, there may be an EU duty to pay depending on the applicable rate. So if the parcel is under £135, very de minimis, that means that no duty is required there, but above there may be duty, but that of course might be subject to waivers or reliefs kind of under the TCA. So in summary there, the non-UKIMS journey, you do need to confirm that it's a non-UKIMS movement. The operator will be submitting a customs declaration, including a 10-digit commodity code and a safety and security declaration. There might be intelligence-led checks on those goods, and duty may be owed as well. So I will pass back to Simon, who's going to be taking you through some of the other resources and guidance we have available.
Thank you, Ewan, and also thank you, Mark and Catherine, for taking us through that content. Very, very useful. So as you can see on the screen here, we have published a number of pieces of guidance on gov.uk, and rather than you having to write down the web links, we will post these in the Q&A function so you can directly access those, but that will also just give you some further information and just reaffirm the messages that we've said today, particularly in regards to moving parcels and in relation to the UK Internal Market Scheme, also around where you do pay duty for goods that are moving outside of UKIMS, how you can claim that back under the duty reimbursement scheme. So what we'll do now is we'll move on. I mentioned we had a final poll question that I would like to ask, and if we can move on just to the next slide, my colleague will shortly put another link in the sidebar, and it'd be really useful to help us gauge how useful this content has been, and it would be good to understand how better you feel prepared for these new parcel arrangements compared to the start of the webinar. Obviously, we do have a number of questions that have been coming into the sidebar, and we will be, as I said, looking to address some of those as we progress. But useful to very useful to get a sense of how helpful this has been. And then, as I said, once we go through the questions, we will come back and just share the results of those polls as we go through. So what I'd like to do now is just move on to answering some of the pre-submitted questions firstly. I think some of the questions that we have had in the sidebar are covered by some of these pre-submitted questions, which is useful that we're being asked the same thing. So hopefully we can try and address that. And as I said, if we do have time, we will look to address some of the additional questions that have come up in the Q&A function. The first question, if I can come to you, Mark, the first question we had is a UKIMS authorisation required now to move a business-to-business parcel not at risk?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And yeah, so it's an important point. UKIMS itself is an active authorization that people can and are using for freight movements in order to kind of move goods not at risk, but it is not currently required for B2B parcel movements, and it won't be required until the new arrangements take effect next year. So you don't need to apply an at-risk or not at-risk status to your parcel movement. But as I say, if you're moving goods through other means, you can and may well be using UKIMS at the moment. We do say that just because obviously we need to process those applications ahead of time, and we want people to be able to make the declarations as soon as they are required to. So if you will be moving B2B parcels when the new arrangements come into effect and you haven't got an authorization at the moment, please do not hesitate in submitting an application to make sure that we ensure you're fully prepared by the 31st of March 2025.
Thank you for that, Mark. And just sort of following on from that, a question that popped up in the sidebar was, does a trader and a seller need their own UKIMS number as well as the buyer in Northern Ireland? Useful if you'd be able to just clarify on that, please.
No, so as I think Ewan touched on this a little bit in his presentation of the journeys, but one of the traders, one of the parties, whether that be the sender or the receiver, needs to be UKIMS authorized if a goods are being moved under UKIMS, but it can be either one, and on any particular movement you're only able to move, put one UKIMS authorization against it. So it really is it's not us trying to abdicate responsibility, but I think it's a kind of a commercial decision, and in some cases it may be more appropriate for that to be the sender. In other cases it might be more appropriate for that to be the receiver, and that will be kind of ironed out by your relationship between the kind of customer and seller.
Thanks for that, Mark. And one final question from the pre-submitted questions for yourself, if that's okay. And I think a number of attendees have asked this in the sidebar as well, so hopefully useful to answer this. What evidence do you require to show goods are not at risk under UKIMS? Yeah, so thank you. And I noticed a few sort of variations on this myself, so I'll try my best to do justice to them. So as I said in the last question, it's the importer of record who is responsible for the movements that are declared not at risk under UKIMS, and that can be the seller or the receiver, and needs to be agreed locally whether that is the sender or the receiver. If you're moving goods not at risk under UKIMS, you need to keep supporting evidence for each consignment you move into Northern Ireland, and you must keep that evidence for 5 years. And it'll need to be accessible at an address in the UK that HMRC can visit, and that's why we ask the questions in the application form about what are your record keeping systems, how will you keep these things secure and know that they're all being the authorization is being used properly by people within your business. The types of evidence we allow for supporting a not at risk goods movement include commercial receipts, invoices, VAT invoices, commercial contracts, purchase orders, delivery receipts, consignment notes, proof of installation, electronic records. And we try to not be too prescriptive. What we know, and I think this is what came up out of it in the sort of chat as well, is potentially more challenging for people moving parcels, especially if they are the sender of the goods, is that they may not be responsible for the end destination of the goods. But that, and I think we are quite explicit about this in our guidance, you are still able to be authorized and move goods at not at risk, provided you gain some assurance that the goods will meet the not at risk criteria. Again, to meet that criterion, there's a variety of evidence that can be obtained. Trying not to be prescriptive. One example that we put at the top of our list on the guidance is of a written and signed declaration stating that the goods will remain in Northern Ireland. That depends on the relationship with the customer if that's something you want to do, but information could also be obtained as part of the commercial agreement for supplying goods, i.e. by updating terms and conditions, contracts with customers, or a digital tick box which people complete as an undertaking that the goods will be moved, will be sold in Northern Ireland. As the UKIMS authorization holder, you'll want to make sure that there is a robust way of doing that, and it gives you enough confidence that if someone you've sold the goods onto is abusing that, you have some protection against that. But we look to be pragmatic, and we do see people doing this already, putting those kind of agreements in place with people they're selling their goods to, so that they kind of they're assured that their authorization is being used correctly. Thank you very much for that, Mark. That's incredibly helpful, and hopefully that's helped a number of attendees who are asking the same question. So one of the next pre-submitted questions that we had, and Ewan, I'm going to come to you on this one, was so slightly two-pronged, but do parcel operators understand what not at risk B2B parcel movements are, and will FPOs offer all routes into Northern Ireland for consumer and business parcels?
Yes. So we've been engaging with parcel operators. I mean, in our posting parcels team, we do constantly, but have been extensively and regularly since the negotiation of the Windsor Framework. So including the not on risk criteria. So we do expect them to be able to understand that. Obviously, if someone has a specific concern, they've heard something worrying from somebody, we're very much happy to follow that up on an individual basis. But based on our engagement with that industry, and also I know someone's asked us, does Royal Mail count in this? Yes, I'm kind of counting Royal Mail in this bundle. The vast majority of operators will offer all consumer and business parcel routes. However, this is a commercial decision for those operators to make. So kind of again, as I talked about in the journeys, your mileage may vary. Please do talk to your operators if you have any concerns or if you're worried they might not offer a route.
Thank you for that, Ewan. That is very helpful. And if you don't mind, I'll come back to you on another pre-submitted question that would be useful just to answer. What are the requirements for moving consumer parcels from Northern Ireland to Great Britain? And what are the arrangements for consumer parcels if they are subsequently returned to Northern Ireland?
Sure. So anything moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain qualifies from unfettered access to the rest of the UK, including when sending to consumers in Great Britain. This means there's no customs requirements for that route. Parcels, and so just to kind of plain English that as today, it should look the same. If something is then being returned back to that business in Northern Ireland, so kind of a C to B movement, I think there's kind of two answers here. If it is a kind of undeliverable or return to sender parcel, so let's say it's kind of been sent from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, but it just never gets to that recipient for whatever reason, the address is wrong, incorrect information has been given and it stays within that network. So the parcel network's basically just pinging it back to you. Then no additional information is required. It can kind of move straight back to you in Northern Ireland. However, if it's a return where someone has accepted the good and just wants to return it back, they don't like it or there's a problem with it, etc., it will move along that consumer journey that I took you through before, but flipped around. So the consumer returning would need to give some information, or you might be able to give the information to the parcel operator to create a new movement, but there'll be no individual customs declarations, no duty, no safety and security requirements, as we went through with that in the journey.
Thank you for that, Ewan. Again, another really helpful response, so hopefully that is useful to those attending. Just whilst we have you on the mic, there was a couple of other questions that would be useful for you to pick up if that's okay. And the first one would be, can green and red lane consignments move in the same lorry? So I suppose, can you move consumer parcels, business parcels, both at risk and under UKIMS, in the same lorry?
Yes. Oh, sorry, just picking over the live there. Yes, so they can all move, and kind of we refer to this as a mixed load in the lorry. But yes, kind of internal market movements, kind of non-UKIMS movements, consumer movements can all move together in the same truck, the same lorry, the same plane. But each individual parcel will need to be following the relevant process for that movement. So just because you've got stuff mixed together, it doesn't mean it necessarily needs to go to kind of the most extensive progress. Everything doesn't become suddenly red lane as a result. But also on the same token, if you've got red lane stuff moving alongside consumer parcels, they can't all move along the same rules as consumer parcels.
Thank you for that, Ewan. Again, hopefully useful to respond to that question in the chat. And one final question, and this is the most liked question, so hopefully good to get an answer there. And Mark, I think if I can come to you, because I think this links to some of the stuff you were talking about earlier in relation to evidence and the movements of goods. I won't read out the full question, it's quite lengthy from Catherine, but how do you treat goods which are sold to a customer in Northern Ireland for stock? So sometimes may go by and then the parts we supply for the stock to the customer in Northern Ireland are now being sold to customers in Southern Ireland or the EU. Can I maybe come to you just to give a response to that?
Yeah, so yeah, and I saw that question, and it's one we get as well in the kind of freight space. You know, as we've been saying, if you're using a UKIMS authorization, you are giving, a sort of, undertaking. You're saying that those goods are not at risk. And in the example you've given there, you don't have. It would seem you don't have that level of assurance, and because the goods are going into a location and then they may be moved, and 1% might end up in Ireland or somewhere in the EU, or 99%. In that case, we advise that you declare not at risk what you are certain is going to remain in Northern Ireland, and if you're not certain, you can make an at-risk. It should be an at-risk declaration. To try to mitigate that, we appreciate that you might make a declaration at risk, and then find that actually you did sell them to a customer in Northern Ireland, and that's why we have mitigations like the duty reimbursement scheme, which enables you to kind of reclaim duty where you've paid it, but then are able to evidence that your goods are stayed in Northern Ireland or stayed in stayed in the UK, and therefore you're able to claim a reimbursement there.
Thank you for that, Mark. That's really helpful to answer that, and hopefully Catherine and others who were liking that question have got sort of an appropriate answer there. Now we are drawing very close to the end of the session today. So again, I wanted to just say a big thank you, firstly to our presenters, so to you and Mark and Catherine for taking the time out to go through that with you today, and also to the hundreds of attendees who have joined today for sparing the time to engage with us, and hopefully this has been helpful. I said I would quickly circle back round at the end of the session to go through the results to the polls that we put in the sidebar. So some interesting feedback that we're getting there. So at the start of the session, I think roughly only 10% of attendees said that they felt prepared for the new parcel arrangements under the Windsor Framework, with a sizable chunk of about 35% saying that they, about 50% saying that they disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. Going back then to the second question, saying I feel better prepared for the new arrangements than I did at the start of the webinar, we have seen a shift up with around almost 50% of attendees saying that they now feel better prepared following this webinar, which is really positive, and hopefully this has been helpful to kind of help get a better understanding of these new arrangements. There still is a chunk of businesses who have said that they either disagree or strongly disagree with that statement, around about 15% of those. So we'll take obviously that feedback on board with the questions that we haven't managed to get to, either from the pre-submissions or from the Q&A function today, and we will use that to, as I said, tailor, either pick up individually on a one-to-one basis or tailor our comms and guidance as we progress up to the 31st of March. So we are now bang on 3 o'clock. So again, thank you very much for your time today, and I'd like to wish you a good day and speak to you soon.